Jerry Garcia's life was like a wild ride on a twisting highway, full of unexpected turns, close calls, and moments of pure magic. Before he became the legendary heart of the Grateful Dead, before stadiums filled with swirling tie-dye and swirling guitar solos, his world was shaped by early tragedies and raw ambition. In this video, we're going to trace the journey that took a shy kid with a missing fingertip and turned him into an icon whose music moved millions. So, buckle up. It's time to dive deep into Jerry Garcia's long, strange trip. Let's roll all the way back to when Jerry was barely out of diapers. Picture the Santa Cruz Mountains in 1946. This was supposed to be a laid-back family vacation. 4-year-old Jerry was helping his older brother Tiff chop wood for a simple campfire. It sounds harmless enough. Tiff swung the axe while Jerry cleared the chopped logs. But one small mistake changed everything. The timing got off, Tiff's axe came down wrong, and in a split second it struck Jerry's hand. With no time to lose, his mother Ruth wrapped his finger in a towel and raced him to the hospital. At the time, Jerry was just a terrified little kid. He didn't grasp what had happened. His family kept the truth from him until the bandages finally came off. That was when he realized, to his shock, that half of his finger was simply gone. In a strange way, losing part of that finger would eventually help define Jerry's unique guitar style years later, but back then it was only the first major heartbreak he'd face. The very next year, in 1947, tragedy struck again. During another family getaway, this time at the Trinity River in California's north, Jerry's father, Jose, often called Joe, took what should have been a peaceful break to go fly fishing. Jose had music in his blood, a professional musician and bar owner who had passed on some of that artistic spark to his children. But suddenly, he slipped and tumbled into the river's rushing current. As Jerry would recall decades later in Rolling Stone, he watched, helpless from the shore, as his father disappeared beneath the water. No heroic rescue came in time. Jose Garcia drowned, and Jerry's family was shattered. His mother Ruth took control of her late husband's bar, while Jerry and Tiff were sent to live with their grandparents. During this period, Jerry found a path toward music, maybe as an escape from the pain, maybe as a way to connect with something larger than himself. It was a spark that would guide him for the rest of his life. Before Jerry Garcia's music career truly began, his journey of self-expression was nurtured by a key figure during his early school days. At Monroe Elementary School, Jerry's third-grade teacher recognized his budding artistic talents and provided him with encouragement that would leave a lasting impression. Through her guidance, Jerry realized that being a creative person wasn't just a dream, it was a real path in life. This early spark of inspiration planted the seed for the creativity that would later define his legendary contributions to music and art. By the time Jerry Garcia reached his teenage years, the cultural landscape of California was changing at breakneck speed. The lingering aftershocks of World War II had given way to a restless youth eager to define their own identity. And California's thriving car culture, hot rod shows, and rock and roll dances offered a vivid playground for experimentation. Garcia, sensitive and curious, was swept up in this energetic swirl. He absorbed the musical influences of local radio stations, idolized the swagger of burgeoning rock guitarists, and watched as the beats challenged conventional thinking in smoky coffee houses. Amid this newfound freedom, however, there was an undercurrent of danger. Drugs were easy to come by, and late-night drives pushed old sedans to their limits. It was in this electric environment, equal parts exhilarating and perilous, that Garcia began forging his own path, one that would soon lead him to embrace music not just as a pastime, but as the center of his life. The 1950s and early 60s were a time when California's youth culture was exploding with energy. Rock and roll was thriving, and the beat movement was electrifying San Francisco. It's no wonder Jerry wanted to soak it all in. But one day in 1961, that free-spirited drive for adventure turned deadly. He and his buddies were cruising around in a car, probably feeling invincible, searching for a good time. California's car culture was at its peak. Fast rides, open roads, and rock music blasting on the radio. But at a bone-chilling 140 kilometers per hour, the driver lost control, sending the car careening into a guardrail. The vehicle flipped and spun through the air. In a terrifying instant, Jerry was thrown right through the windshield and landed with such force in a nearby field that even his shoes were ripped off his feet. He ended up with a broken collarbone, stunned and rattled, but still breathing. Tragically, another passenger in the car was not so lucky, losing his life that day. This horrifying accident etched itself into Jerry's memory, and in many ways nudged him further toward the idea that life was unpredictable and all too fragile, something that would later flow into the music he made, where themes of death, fate, and chance run deep. Fast forward a few decades, and Jerry Garcia had become a cultural icon, the leader of the Grateful Dead, whose mix of folk, blues, rock, and psychedelia turned them into one of the biggest counterculture symbols of the 1960s and beyond. Over time, the 60s melted into the 70s and 80s, and Garcia evolved as an artist, respected and almost worshipped by the Deadheads, who followed him everywhere. During a rare afternoon off in the late 70s, Jerry Garcia supposedly wandered along a quiet stretch of the Santa Cruz coastline, guitar slung over his shoulder. Restless and searching for a moment of calm, he followed the glow of a distant bonfire until he came upon a small circle of college students. They recognized him instantly, but no one broke the spell with big introductions. Instead, Jerry settled in and began strumming a gentle bluesy riff that drifted into the twilight air. Without any stage lights or ticket lines, they all became part of something simple and honest. Just laughter, stories, and improvised harmonies, echoing against the sound of crashing waves. After nearly an hour of music and laughter under the fading sun, Garcia rose, thanked them quietly, and slipped back into the night. No cameras rolled, no deals were made, yet everyone who shared that moment carried a memory as warm and real as the sand beneath their feet. Jerry Garcia's passion for music was never confined to a single genre. Beyond his monumental work with the Grateful Dead, he found time to explore bluegrass with the band Old and in the Way. This side project allowed Jerry to showcase his versatility as a musician, bringing bluegrass music to a wider audience and proving that his talent transcended the psychedelic rock scene. With their heartfelt melodies and masterful harmonies, the band introduced countless fans to a style of music that was both nostalgic and refreshingly authentic. But through the highs and lows of his life, his struggles with addiction, his triumphant live performances, and his gentle, introspective spirit, he tried to keep some sense of family love and loyalty intact. This brings us back to his final marriage to Deborah Coons, who had known Garcia for years before they married in 1994. Sadly, Garcia passed away in 1995, leaving not just a musical legacy but also a complicated personal estate. After his death, tensions flared, and many saw Deborah's actions, particularly concerning how Garcia's remains were handled and how control was exerted over his estate, as a cruel twist, a move that felt like a betrayal to those who believed they understood Garcia's generous and free-spirited soul. Legal battles and bitter disputes followed, and even the scattering of his ashes became a charged symbol of how divided the family and inner circle had become. For fans who cherished Garcia's warmth and openness, seeing the final chapter of his personal life play out in such a painful way left a haunting note on a story already filled with hardship and loss. From that lost finger in the Santa Cruz Mountains to the drowning of his father, from car crash close calls to a legacy that included not only music, but also deep family strife. Jerry Garcia's journey was never simple. The raw wounds of his early years and the complex struggles of his later life cast long shadows, hinting at deeper truths about fate, love, and loyalty. It's a reminder that even legends are shaped by tragic events and human failings, and that the stories we tell ourselves about our heroes often only scratch the surface of who they really are. Garcia had been sitting right where the guy who ended up dying had been sitting only moments before the car crash. Just imagine that. They'd swapped seats in some kind of casual last-second shuffle, and fate took its shot. When the car spun out of control, Garcia survived and the other passenger didn't. For Garcia, that experience wasn't just scary, it was like the universe handing him a second life. He later said, "That was the slingshot for the rest of my life. It was like a second chance. Then I got serious." And he meant it. That brush with death lit a fire under him. From that point on, Garcia threw himself completely into his music, practicing guitar for hours and taking up any little gig he could find, often playing small, intimate sets at coffee houses around the Bay Area. In 1963, while performing at a coffee house tucked behind a bookstore, Garcia met Sarah Ruppenthal. She was working there and going to Stanford, while he was still this young, free-spirited musician, just barely out of his teens. Together, they formed a sweet little duo, and their harmonies drew people in. But that wasn't all they created. When Sarah told Jerry she was pregnant, you can imagine the nerves. She was juggling school, their music, and now this giant life changer. But Garcia didn't hesitate. He replied, "I've always wanted to be married." With that, they rushed into a quick wedding. Part of it was romantic, and part of it was Garcia not wanting people to gossip. It was all very sudden, but in the early 60s, life in the Bay Area was shifting fast anyway, so why not? Of course, the car crash had changed Garcia's mindset. But what really flipped his world upside down was psychedelics. According to him, acid made him realize that his attempt at a normal, straight-laced life just wasn't going to cut it. In the mid-60s, the Bay Area was bubbling with an energy that felt brand new and limitless. The Grateful Dead, initially known as the Warlocks, found themselves at the epicenter of something that went beyond just music. Under the influence of psychedelics, they experimented fearlessly with sound, stretching songs into free-flowing, improvisational journeys that dared audiences to follow along. Meanwhile, Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters were throwing the now legendary acid tests, where revelers sipped LSD-laced Kool-Aid under swirling strobe lights and day-glow paint. The Dead served as the unofficial house band for these mind-bending gatherings, turning each performance into a living tapestry of color, rhythm, and imagination. In that otherworldly environment, the band discovered that their music could be a vehicle for spiritual exploration, community bonding, and a radical redefinition of what a concert could mean. This wasn't about polished hits or rehearsed encores. It was about creating entire universes in sound, night after night, and daring listeners to take the ride. The Grateful Dead, although at first called the Warlocks, were coming together in this swirl of creativity, mind-bending substances, and visionary energy. They provided the soundtrack for these trippy gatherings, surrounded by strobe lights, day-glow paint, and a swirling mix of hippies, visionaries, and seekers. One of the most pivotal moments came when a thoroughly stoned Garcia randomly opened a dictionary and landed his finger on the phrase, "Grateful Dead." The words described a spirit of a deceased person or an angel giving thanks to someone who arranged their burial out of kindness. That strange, eerie definition stuck, and the band claimed it as their name. By the mid-60s, the Bay Area's psychedelic experiments, fueled by Ken Kesey's acid tests, had evolved into a full-blown cultural movement. The Grateful Dead's willingness to push musical boundaries turned them into pioneers of this new frontier, and Garcia stood at the center, radiating that signature grin and warm aura. Rather than just providing a soundtrack, they helped shape a philosophy of community, exploration, and spiritual liberation that defined a generation. As for Garcia's personal life, though, it was getting complicated. He and Sarah had a daughter and had been married for 3 years, but with LSD opening new doors in their minds, both of them drifted into other relationships. By 1966, they had separated, and in 1967, the very same year the Grateful Dead released their debut album, the divorce was finalized. This was the summer of love era, after all, and marriage norms were getting tossed out the window. Garcia was free to wander into his next relationship. Garcia's personal life mirrored the restless, boundary-pushing spirit of the era. He gravitated toward people who, like him, were questioning old rules and searching for new ways to live and love. This meant that his relationships were often spontaneous, unconventional, and entangled with the counterculture's embrace of freedom and experimentation. The line between friendship and romance could blur, and long-term commitments sometimes gave way to open-ended arrangements that reflected the radical shift in social norms. Through it all, Garcia's gentle demeanor, generous heart, and magnetic presence attracted partners who felt drawn to the same star he was chasing, one that promised endless possibility, spiritual connection, and a life defined by creativity rather than convention. Enter Mountain Girl, whose real name was Carolyn Adams. She was basically the ultimate psychedelic muse of the era. But there was a twist. Mountain Girl had just had a baby with Ken Kesey. Mountain Girl realized she needed stability for herself and her child, so she headed back from Mexico to California, looking to plant her feet on more solid ground. When she hopped off the bus and saw Garcia, she had a crystal clear vision of them being together, like fate tapping her on the shoulder. Garcia, famously kind and open-hearted, said to her, "You could stay with me," and that was it. Mountain Girl moved right into the band's old Victorian house in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Their love burned bright, at least until the band hit the road. Mountain Girl suspected Garcia's on-tour escapades weren't exactly faithful, but she tried not to dig too deep. As the 60s gave way to the 70s, the scene changed. Things got heavier, and not just metaphorically. While Garcia and the band were recording what would become their masterpiece, American Beauty, released in 1970 and containing some of their most enduring songs, Garcia's mother, Ruth, took a tragic turn. She was out driving around Twin Peaks with a friend and her dog when the animal somehow got tangled up near the pedals. The car swerved off a cliff, leaving Ruth in critical condition. Though Garcia's relationship with his mom had always been bumpy, she'd been a tough, independent figure who ran a bar after losing her husband. This accident pushed Garcia to her side. Every day for a month, he visited her in the hospital until she finally passed away in September 1971. This heartbreak seeped into the music. Robert Hunter, the band's lyricist, once said that the emotional texture on American Beauty was partly fueled by Garcia's pain over his mother's accident and eventual death. You can almost hear it in the warm guitar lines and the aching harmonies. The album was a huge hit, elevating the Dead's status and sending them back on the road. Endless touring might have helped Garcia escape his grief for a few hours each night, but it was never a permanent fix. Garcia also struggled with hard drugs, Sometimes the shows would be sloppy. He'd get so zonked out, he could barely remember the lyrics, drooling on the mic and humming when words slipped his mind. This isn't rumor or myth. Drummer Bill Kreutzmann wrote about it in his tell-all book, spilling the details of how Garcia would be so incapacitated he couldn't function. Yet somehow the Deadheads kept coming, the audience growing larger and more devoted, becoming their own subculture of cosmic travelers. They found ways to enjoy the shows that went way beyond the music. Deaf fans clutched balloons to feel the vibrations. The wharf rats held 12-step meetings during set breaks, and the spinners twirled themselves into spiritual trances. The Dead's world was like a carnival of human variety, and at the center of it was Garcia, part reluctant guru, part weary rock star. From the outside looking in, you might think Garcia would be happy swimming in this bizarre ocean of devotion and freedom. But what did his family think? His daughter Trixie said that behind the scenes the band could be pretty cynical. They saw themselves like a band of pirates, and they were being followed around by what felt to them like an army of tie-dye wearing, tofu-munching disciples. Garcia's daughter with mountain girl Annabelle remembered growing up in this heady environment. She saw young fans overdoing substances and turning into zombies at shows. It turned her off drugs permanently, a kind of built-in just say no lesson. If only Garcia himself could have heeded that warning. As the years rolled on, Garcia's love life didn't get any simpler. By 1973, his relationship with Mountain Girl was hitting a wall. He'd always had a roaming eye, easily distracted by new encounters. And where did Garcia find his next romantic spark? At a Grateful Dead show, of course. That's where Deborah Coons entered the picture. Coons, who came from a comfortable background and dreamed of becoming a filmmaker, started corresponding with Garcia the old-fashioned way, through letters. By 1974, they leveled up the relationship. She moved in with Garcia and even tried following him on tour, but the grind was too intense for her taste. It wasn't exactly a surprise. Constant touring wore everyone down, and even as Coons tried to fit into Garcia's wild world, it must have felt overwhelming. At the same time, the band itself was on edge, stressed out from constant shows, internal tensions, and growing pains. They decided on a series of farewell concerts and then took a break in 1974, though, of course, it wouldn't be the last anyone heard of the Grateful Dead. As for Garcia's personal life, after tossing Mountain Girl aside for 2 years with Coons, he actually went back to Mountain Girl, hoping to rekindle what they'd once had. To her credit, Mountain Girl gave it another shot, even as she was probably wondering what kind of roller coaster ride she'd signed up for. This was just one more twist in Garcia's long and winding personal story. Love, loss, music, madness, it all blurred together. Over the next decades, his relationships and struggles would continue shifting like California fog, always drifting between what he thought he wanted and what he knew he needed. Yet through it all, the music and the legend continued to grow, pushing Garcia forward into new chapters, whether he was ready for them or not. Garcia had escaped death by inches in that fateful car crash, but he couldn't dodge the downward spiral of addiction forever. It got so bad that Annabelle, his daughter with Mountain Girl, sat him down and begged him to change. She also offered a pretty blunt explanation for why her father went through so many wives and lovers. He was always looking for the one to make it right. The next thing he knew, they were trying to get money off of him. This might sound harsh, but looking at Garcia's chaotic personal and financial world, it's not hard to see where she was coming from. There were obsessive fans, stressful money issues, terrible losses, nonstop relationship drama, and just to make things even more intense, there was the presence of the Hells Angels, an infamous biker gang known for their own brand of counterculture. The Dead had crossed paths with the Angels from the early days, partly because they both operated outside mainstream society, and sometimes their scenes overlapped at parties, acid tests, and concerts, but the connection didn't always feel peaceful. At one show, the Hells Angels roared backstage on their motorcycles, knives out, demanding that the band play Truckin'. When a tour manager asked Garcia what was up with hanging around such rough company, Garcia shrugged and said, "Well, good wouldn't mean much without evil." The Grateful Dead were all about blending opposites, light and darkness, order and chaos. So maybe for Garcia, the Angels were just another part of the strange tapestry of his life. The band's finances were as wild as their lifestyle. They employed an unusually huge crew of people who depended on them for paychecks, and Garcia felt like he had to keep going, keep playing, keep earning. On top of that, there was his $100 a day drug habit, worth about $2,600 a day in today's money, a massive burn that drained his resources and his health. Exhausted, addicted, and under constant pressure, Garcia tried to solve his money and responsibility problems by piling on more work. He took extra gigs as a solo artist, never giving himself time to rest. By the mid-1980s, the Grateful Dead had scored a massive hit with A Touch of Grey, and the band's popularity soared. But while the crowds were bigger than ever, Garcia's condition was worse than ever. He'd gotten heavier, his voice was shot from cigarettes and who knows what else, and he was so out of it on stage that he sometimes rested his chin on the microphone just to stay upright. The band couldn't ignore it anymore. In 1985, they gave him an ultimatum: get help or else. Garcia checked into rehab, but by July 1986, everything caught up with him. His body pushed to the brink, gave out, and he slipped into a diabetic coma for 5 days. During that time, he had strange, vivid visions. When he finally woke up, he must have felt some relief just to be alive. But the comeback wouldn't be simple. He had to relearn basic skills and even teach himself guitar all over again. In spite of the odds, by the end of 1986, Garcia and the Dead made a big return, kicking off their show with Touch of Grey. The song's famous line, "I will get by, I will survive," felt like a second chance, a fresh start. This supposed new beginning saw Garcia trying to clean up his act. He married Menasha Matheson in a spiritual ceremony, and they had a daughter, Heather, born in 1987. Hoping to find health and peace, Garcia moved to Hawaii, took up scuba diving, became a vegetarian, and tried cutting back on cigarettes. But old habits die hard. Maybe longing for the spark of his early days, he ran off to reconnect with Barbara Bridget Meyer, an old flame who had given him his very first guitar back in the 1960s. Still, the question of quitting the band nagged at him. Barbara later recalled asking Garcia why he didn't just walk away from the Grateful Dead and its crushing load. He answered simply, "Do you know how many people are depending on this show going down the road?" For Garcia, stepping off the stage wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who relied on the band's massive operation. That sense of responsibility was a blessing and a curse, tying him to a life that might have been killing him. By the mid-1990s, things were at a breaking point. The group's final run of shows was so troubled that fans called it the Tour of Doom. Everything felt off: crowd problems, terrifying weather, including fans being struck by lightning, and a bad vibe hanging over the scene. Their last concert, at Chicago's Soldier Field in July 1995, was a confusing mix of painful mistakes and occasional brilliance. One review asked, "Is this a new beginning or the beginning of the end?" That line could have summed up Garcia's entire life, constantly tipping between disaster and beauty. In July 1995, right on the heels of that final tension-filled show at Soldier Field, Jerry Garcia made a last-ditch attempt to break free from the chains that had held him for so long. He checked into the Betty Ford Center, seeking a clean slate, and then moved on to Serenity Knolls, a treatment facility tucked into the serene, rolling hills of Northern California. Maybe on some level he knew this was his last shot at reclaiming a measure of peace. He'd been through it all. Countless tours, shifting band dynamics, financial pressures, a body worn down by decades of hard living, and a mind haunted by personal losses and unfulfilled dreams. Perhaps in those final days he grappled more honestly than ever before with the weight of his responsibilities, the hopes of millions of fans, and the legacy he would leave behind. But sometimes, no amount of willpower, rehab, or second chances can rewrite the ending. On August 9th, 1995, Garcia's heart gave out while he slept. By the time staff found him, he'd slipped quietly into the next world, still wearing that gentle, enigmatic smile that Deadheads everywhere knew so well. In a way, that final smile was like his music, mysterious, comforting, and open to interpretation. It might have signaled relief or maybe acceptance or even the kind of cosmic understanding he'd spent his life searching for through melody and improvisation. For those who loved him, the news hit like a shockwave. Fans who had followed the band across endless miles of highway suddenly felt a piece of their own identity slip away. Friends and family struggled to piece together the fractured puzzle of his final years. Even after Jerry Garcia's passing, his influence continued to resonate across generations. Tributes poured in from fans, musicians, and even those who had never attended a Grateful Dead concert. Documentaries like Long Strange Trip and biographies delved into his life, revealing the intricate balance of his genius and struggles. In San Francisco, murals of Garcia appeared as a lasting tribute to his legacy, while annual gatherings of Deadheads celebrated his music in heartfelt sing-alongs. His guitar riffs and lyrics didn't just fade, they became part of the cultural fabric, inspiring countless artists to embrace improvisation, authenticity, and the beauty of imperfection. The world lost a man who, despite his flaws and missteps, had conjured soundscapes that helped countless listeners make sense of their own tangled lives. In that instant, as the final notes of his story faded, all that was left was the record he'd left behind, a lifetime of music filled with sorrow, laughter, longing, and hope. At the time of his death, he was legally married to Deborah Coons Garcia, the same filmmaker girlfriend from the 1970s. But in death, as in life, trouble followed. Coons barred Mountain Girl and another ex-wife from attending Garcia's funeral, making an already painful moment worse. She then challenged the divorce settlement Garcia had agreed to pay Mountain Girl, forcing Mountain Girl into court to fight for what she was owed. Instead of the promised $5 million, Mountain Girl settled for $1.25 million. Even Jerry's youngest daughter, Helen, got tangled in a lawsuit with Coons. It was a sad, bitter note to end the story of a man who had tried, however imperfectly, to spread love and joy through his music. In the end, Jerry Garcia's story wasn't just about the music, the fans, or even the drugs. It was about a man wrestling with fate, family, love, and loss, all while trying to keep the show on the road. His life reminds us that even the brightest stars carry shadows. As we look back on the winding path he took, filled with heartbreak, inspiration, betrayal, and unforgettable tunes, we're left with one truth. His journey was every bit as complicated and human as the songs that still echo today.